On behalf of the Social Science Department, I want to thank all of you that are here today, whether under coercion or by your own free will. We're really proud to be able to offer this series of lectures for Black History Month. One of the things that inspired us to do this is we thought that there are so many different ways that we can reach people outside of our classroom to talk about these issues which are so important to us in terms of diversity in the American past. And there's a lot of things that folks in our department are very interested in that don't fit nicely into an economics class or a political science class. And so we wanted to be able to share some of these things with you. What I'm going to talk about today is, I hope, what would be a good kickoff for all of these lectures. I think everything will build on each other, so the more of these that you can attend, the better off you'll be. But what I want to talk about today is included in the title of my presentation here, you know, why Black history still matters. For those of you that don't know, there's a constant debate, and has been for about a decade now, about whether we should be celebrating Black History Month or whether it should go away. There's a whole area of literature that's associated with this particular topic, and it's become more powerful in the last couple years. There are a lot of folks out there that believe that its time has passed. There are others who think that a month isn't long enough. What I'm really interested in is one particular aspect of this, and I've tried to include this in the subtitle. Americans today are famous for, especially white Americans, frankly, for talking about a colorless society, that they are colorblind, that racism doesn't exist. And I hear this from students all the time in my classes, and I hear it from friends, I hear it from family members. I don't judge anybody according to the color of their skin. I treat everybody the same way. Nobody I know was a slave owner. Nobody I know was a slave. Therefore, everything's good. Everything's gone away. We've already had the 1960s. We've had our civil rights movement. So people should just forget about it, especially Black Americans. They should stop complaining, and they should start participating in American society. To me, as a historian, I think there are major flaws with that particular line of thinking. One of the things that we understand about race is that it's a social construct. And what we mean by that is that it's invented. It isn't real. Scientists tell us all the time, whether we're looking at DNA or microbiology or whatever it might be, that race as a scientific fact does not exist. There's more likelihood that there's genetic variation between two people who look white than a person who might look white next to a black individual. So race as a biological or as a scientific issue, it's not real. It doesn't exist. One of the things that's done to the debate about Black history, for example, is it's taken it in a couple different directions. There are lots of folks who will argue that because racism isn't biologically real, that it's not a fact, a scientific fact, then that actually reduces the need for things like Black History Month or for things like affirmative action. That was a concept that came up recently in Michigan in the debates over Proposal 2. In other words, why keep these things around? They just keep reminding us of a past that doesn't exist any longer, things that we've already fixed. We shouldn't be dwelling on these sorts of things. It just causes more division. We need to all be together. So that's a little bit about this color blindness. I think the more you look for this, the more that you're going to see this, especially in your personal relationships with people. So, just sort of by way of introduction, let's move forward with this a little bit. I've asked you to do this in pairs, although the way that you folks are sitting, and I don't want the camera to necessarily pan out, it's going to be a little difficult. But let's take a minute or two, and I wanted to hear from you about what you think might be examples of inequality in American society today based on race. And I'm not necessarily looking for you right now to talk about these things or to label them as racism. But what I would like you to do is to think about what areas of life do we notice inequalities between the races? Is there anybody that can think of anything? I've given you an example here. The judicial system is rife with inequalities between the races. You look at, this is 2002 statistics, but the percentage of adult men incarcerated, adults being 18 and above. In Michigan, the dominant population, of course, would be whites or Caucasians, 1% of the population imprisoned in 2002. Hispanics, 2.8%, and African Americans, 7.6% of the population above the ages of 18 incarcerated in Michigan in 2002. The early statistics that we have for today, 2007, this is worse. The presentation that you're going to hear after mine today from Professor DeVivo, he'll have more of these sorts of statistics to share with you. So I think this is a good opportunity to build on each other. But what do you think? Is there anything besides the judicial system that you can think of where there are these sorts of inequalities? Housing issues. And can you explain that?
Rentals, and purchasing homes, racial prejudice on, well, it's available and it's not available.
Okay, disparities in the rates for home ownership between whites and blacks, and whether racism is involved in that or not. But how does that happen? Why are so many more whites homeowners than black Americans in society? I think that's an excellent point. We'll talk about that. Yes, sir.
Disparities in education, specifically public school education.
Okay, and can you be more explicit? He said disparities in public school education. Can you explain that a little bit more?
As far as how funding for our schools is appropriated based on property tax, and how the average property tax in the inner city, the average income and the average price of a home or whatever in the inner city is going to be less than that of the suburbs or elsewhere, and how that directly affects how our schools are funded.
Yeah, so piggybacking on what was mentioned earlier in terms of home ownership and the disparities there, you mentioned that there's a difference in the amount of appropriations and fundings for schools based on property tax disparities between suburbs and inner cities. Very good. Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
I think mine is related to schools too. I guess a while back, schools went to zero tolerance policies in their schools, and the inner city schools. That really meant a lot of things that happen in schools. If there were an incident, that the police are called in almost immediately with their zero tolerance. And there are some cases, maybe 10 years ago, where it seems like it affected blacks in urban settings a lot more than other areas where things would have normally been handled in the school, but with zero tolerance policies, you got the courts and juvenile issues going on a lot quicker.
So zero tolerance policies in public school settings have led to greater scrutiny in public schools, which are populated more in the inner cities by black Americans?
You go straight to the legal system versus principal's office or counseling or talking to parents.
Very good. Very good. How about one more? Let's do one more before we move on.
Access to health.
Access to health care. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I think it's from pre-birth, the statistics of infant mortality.
Yeah. Infant mortality, lower birth weights, there's all sorts of indicators that have a lot to do with poverty but are also tagged to race. Race and poverty intersect in that example. Very good. All right, so I guess the question then, that begs the question that if race still matters, if race is still a factor in American life, whatever happened to racism? Why is it that racism no longer exists? Why is it that we don't need, for example, Proposal 2 any longer if race is still a factor in American life? There is a healthy academic debate. I've included two of my favorite authors on this particular topic from both sides of the spectrum, Shelby Steele and Eduardo Silva. And Steele and Silva both talk about this particular topic from different perspectives, and I'll give you just a brief synopsis of what they're both about. Very, very brief. They're much more detailed than this. But Shelby Steele is the author of a book called A Dream Deferred, which was published in 1999. And what he talks about is that systems of racial preference, for example, like affirmative action embodied in Proposal 2, the arguments around Proposal 2, are more about white guilt than they are about actual racism in American society. What he seems to indicate is that white Americans need these sorts of efforts like affirmative action to be able to make themselves feel good about racial progress rather than doing anything substantial for black Americans. And he, of course, pushes the mantra that people should be judged as individuals and not as groups. And so there's a lot of pressure from somebody like Shelby Steele for individuals to say, I do that. I judge individuals based on their character, the quality of their character, their actions, not the color of their skin. But I will tell you, his arguments have been used to undermine efforts like Black History Month. It's very, very interesting how these things will work. Silva is a very recent author. He published a book called Racism Without Racists, Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in the United States, which was published last year. He talks about racism still being present, and he spends a lot of time on racism that we would call structural racism, racism that's housed in our institutions and in our actions, but we don't see it, we don't call it that. But he also spends a good deal of time on the racism that's in our language, how we talk about each other and to each other. He has a whole chapter on how to talk nasty about minorities without sounding racist. And I know I put BS here as, initials for him. It doesn't look exactly right the way I see it now, but that's from his book, right? How to Talk Nasty About Minorities Without Sounding Racist. And he goes through a whole study of linguistic responses from students, from other academics, from lay people on the streets, and when they're dealing with issues of race, how do they respond? What are the things that they talk about? And he notices a lot of themes there where people are still exhibiting racial bias in their language, but it's coded, it's suppressed, it's harder to find, it's easier to hide today. Some people might call that political correctness. In other words, people know how to speak the language of race without being necessarily offensive. Yet they still harbor the same ideologies. They harbor the same beliefs. Do you have a question? Okay, yes. Yeah, very classic. Yeah, Barack Obama's candidacy for president of the United States and all of the indications that he is somehow a very articulate black man. You hear that frequently on newscasts from people who would never claim to be racist, yet there's something hidden in that message that, somehow it would be a shock that a black man could be as articulate as he is. So I wanted to introduce you to sort of two sides of that academic debate. And of course there's a lot of stuff that happens in the middle as well. It's not just on either side. Both of those guys, Shelby, Steele, and Silva, are more sociologists than they are historians. So I always, and I have a bias about this myself since we're talking about bias, I always say, why doesn't somebody just ask the historian? If it's up to me to explain this, I would say racism never left the building, if I can borrow that from a sort of Elvisology. But racism has always been with us, and it hasn't disappeared. What we haven't done in this country is taken the proper steps to be able to destroy the legacy of racism as it was structured and institutionalized under slavery. So I've broken this down. What we're going to talk about, I can't do this justice today because we have such short time. So I'm going to briefly go through some of these ideas that I think are important for people to think about when they're studying the American past and they're studying these views of race. First, I want to talk about the promises of Reconstruction. At the end of the Civil War, we had a golden opportunity to take slavery and eradicate it from the American memory by force of arms. It started that way. What I think happened is we failed in that effort, and I'll try to explain a little bit of how that happened. We also had another opportunity in the 1930s when you had an American legislative branch and a president in the White House who believed in creating a social net and uplifting all Americans to create a bottom below which nobody can fall, which was a really great idea that the New Deal embodied, that there's this right that you have as an American citizen to a certain level of prosperity and opportunity, something we talk about all the time, but we rarely try to enact or enforce. And again, I think during the New Deal period in the 1930s, we didn't go far enough. There were some nice ideas that came out on paper, but we didn't follow through. We didn't make it through to the end. And then the 1960s, of course, the apex of this movement for black rights. The idea always is taught, I think to young students especially in American society, that the 1960s solved our problems. What I'd like you to do, and we'll try to do this a little bit today, is to think about how we could have done this more thoroughly. What did we miss? What's missing from this piece? And then we'll talk a little bit about now what does that mean for us? Right, if you start off with Reconstruction, the Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. Anything else that any other person wants to indicate to you that might be a factor in starting the Civil War is related to the issue of slavery in some way, whether it's states' rights or it's economic differences that existed between the North and the South. Slavery was at the heart of that conflict. And although we had a president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, who tried very hard to make the war about something else, I think we know from modern examples that that's not always true. You know, just because a president says it doesn't make it so. There were political reasons for saying those sorts of things in the 1860s, things that Lincoln was very worried about what would happen when the war was over. So he's worried about uniting the country back together, bringing it back together. But slavery is at the heart of it. I always ask students in my classes to think about it this way. If you have 600,000 Americans dying in the Civil War, what would they need on their tombstones? What could we say as a nation, these men died for this? There's a reason that they sacrificed. There's a reason that they lost their lives. This would have to be it, in my estimation. You know, this is the embodiment of what those men fought for. Society was one way. We couldn't live with it that way any longer. We fought over it. Here's what society should look like in the future. Okay? So embodied in these 3 amendments that we call the Civil War Amendments. And really briefly, what those Civil War Amendments do, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Not Abraham Lincoln, right? The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves in this country. Slavery only ended nationwide through constitutional amendment. 13th Amendment to the Constitution. 14th Amendment does all sorts of things, but for our purposes today, the most important would be it allows for citizenship for all newly freed slaves. So a citizenship guarantee, which technically, if you think about it, that should have been the end of the story, right? We wouldn't have needed a civil rights movement 100 years later. Citizenship means equality under the law. Of course, we all know it's more complicated than that. So the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right of black men to vote. These were the embodiments of change. This is the powerful change that was exerted as a result of that bloody conflict that was the Civil War. Of course, I think something is missing from here, right? Freedom, citizenship rights, voting rights. There's a big piece of slavery that's missing, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But think of this as the tombstone, right, for those soldiers that died. How does it fail? Right? I mentioned earlier, Reconstruction fails, in my estimation. It doesn't fail in uniting the country back together. In other words, bringing the southern states back into the United States of America. But what it fails to do is it fails to eradicate the legacy of slavery, because it doesn't matter what you put down on paper. As great as those words in the Constitution sound, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and those are powerful ideologies, they're only words on paper unless you enforce them, unless you live it. That's the way they become a reality. I think Americans, both North and South, after the Civil War ended, failed to live those words. It's a failure of shared proportions. Everybody is to blame, North and South, not just Southerners. I've indicated some pieces of the puzzle to why I think it fails. Of course, Jim Crow, state laws that undermine the spirit, if not the letter of the law, the 15th Amendment, things like the grandfather clause that said, well, you know, if your grandfather couldn't vote in this particular state, then you can't vote, and your children can't vote, and your grandchildren can't vote. It sort of locked people's voting rights out forever. Of course, it doesn't say anything about race, so it doesn't violate the letter of the law, the 15th Amendment, but I think we would all agree, and it doesn't, you know, take a rocket scientist to figure that out, it violates the spirit of the 15th Amendment. Sharecropping, right? Relegating black Americans to an imprisonment that's different than physical chains, but it's an economic bondage where you're tied to a piece of land and you're in debt from the very beginning. And it's very difficult to climb out of that cycle of debt. And imagine a group of people that have to enter into a contractual relationship to farm a plot of land to feed their family at the end of the Civil War, and these people don't know how to read or write. Right? The opportunities for exploitation were enormous. So sharecropping, which lasts for 100 years after the Civil War is over, classic example of one of the failures of Reconstruction. It locks African Americans in place in the same economic pursuits that they engaged in as slaves, which had to be a very difficult thing for them to swallow. And then, of course, everyone knows about, at least I would hope, segregation, right? The story of Rosa Parks and separate but equal facilities. All of these things seek to keep in place inequalities and separate societies that had existed under the institution of slavery. These things are not new ideas. They were embodied in the slave codes. You go back and you read the slave codes from the various southern states, all of these ideas are there. Right? They're just codified in a different way. Times have changed. Finding a loophole, a way to get around the Constitution. Of course, the missing piece, I think, to all this is money. Economic opportunity. Segregation gets there, but it doesn't quite get there. What was slavery all about anyway? When you break it down to its bare bones, what slavery is about economic exploitation. It's about taking advantage of somebody else in terms of their labor, stealing their labor for your own benefit, your own profit. Especially American-style slavery. You know, other societies have practiced slavery that's different in varying degrees, including in Africa. But from an American perspective, from a Western European perspective, this race-based slavery that starts in the 1400s was about economic exploitation first. It was never about race in the beginning. It was about profit. The race became a part of this due to dumb luck, unfortunate instances that occurred. You know, the Portuguese needed workers to grow sugar. Where could you find qualified workers that could live and survive in the tropics? You could find them in West Africa. The Portuguese had already been trading for gold and silver with these West African nations. So there's a long history there of interaction, and Africans sort of fell into that needed labor pool. It didn't start off as race-based slavery. That takes place over a long period of time, 100 years, one law at a time, where people are slowly losing their rights as human beings until you get to the situation of chattel slavery. So if economic exploitation is the key, and in America you have a couple hundred years of economic exploitation, even if you free slaves, even if you give them citizenship, even if you give them voting rights, they're missing out on one major component of American life that matters in terms of opportunity and equality, and that is economic opportunity. Ask students, ask your friends, ask yourselves, what would happen to your family if someone for 5, 6, 7 generations stole your labor? How deep a hole would you be in? In other words, the poorest white person is at a certain level in American society when it comes to economics. Newly freed slaves are way down here in a hole. Just to get up to the lowest level of white Americans, they have to overcome huge obstacles because of everything that's been stolen from them previously. So this issue of reparations for American slaves, which are the descendants of American slaves, which is a highly controversial topic in American life today, is a very important piece of the puzzle, I think. I've given you this statistic, and there isn't anybody that can pin this down with any sort of accuracy, so it's a range, and it's a huge range. But based on the leading economists that I can find that deal with this issue, they estimate that the current value of slave labor contributions to the United States would be between $995 billion and $9.7 trillion. That's what we would have to pay in terms of reparations. I have a quote that I wanted to share with you. This is from Madeleine Albright. And this was delivered in 1999, December of 1999. And I just want you to listen to this for a second, and then as you go on, you'll figure out what she's talking about, but I'd be surprised if you aren't thinking something different at the beginning. The United States strongly supports your effort to provide a measure of justice to those compelled to endure slave or forced labor. Above all, I pay tribute to those who brought us here by insisting that hard questions be asked and answered about accountability for the terrible crimes committed more than a half a century ago. This is the first serious initiative to acknowledge the debt owed to those whose labor was stolen or coerced during that time of outrage and shame, and make no mistake, the debt is huge. No human being should ever be treated as property, and no person can deny the dignity of another without bringing dishonor upon himself. I hope and believe that the people of Germany will support this commitment and recognize its value in further enhancing the respect their nation commands around the world. So Madeleine Albright went to Germany and spoke out in support of 10 billion Deutschmark reparation payments to the descendants of the Holocaust, the survivors of the Holocaust. And everything that she said in those sentences could be applied to the United States, yet there's almost no political will for that sort of discussion to take place. Whether it could work or not, $9.7 trillion, is beside the point. The discussion is worth having. The debate is worth having, because it will tell us something about who we are, where we've been. It's a piece of this puzzle. Now, not to give you whiplash, but to move forward in the short amount of time that we have, The New Deal in the 1930s, an attempt to dig us out of what was probably the greatest economic crisis that this country has ever faced. There are some amazing pieces of legislation that emerged to try to provide a safety net for all Americans. One of the ones that we all think about today and we all talk about today is Social Security. What's the future of Social Security? When it was enacted, I think most people don't realize that the law actually excluded domestic and agricultural workers, which meant that 3/4 of black America were not eligible to gain Social Security payments. Okay, Social Security Act. Again, a missed opportunity. If this is about a safety net for all Americans, why not include all Americans? Okay, what's the reason for this? The Wagner Act. A powerful piece of legislation, maybe not as glamorous as some of the others that come out of the New Deal, but the Wagner Act allowed for unions to legally engage in collective bargaining. It's been the backbone of what has made the working class family in America a success. The Wagner Act did not require that unions desegregate. There was discussion about that. It was part of the debate about the fullness of the Wagner Act. Long ago, labor unions in the early 1800s, the mid-1800s, the late 1800s had talked about race as a qualifying factor for membership in union activity. So as late as the 1970s, many craft unions are still all white. And I want you to think about the benefits that pile up for families as this is extended out over time in wages, health care, all sorts of things that can enhance a family's ability to succeed and to climb the economic ladder in American life. And blacks are easily shut out as a result of this failure. Just to give you an example, one of the strongest unions in terms of wages in the 1970s was the Los Angeles Steamfitters, 3,000 strong, all white. No black member ever in the history of that union until the 1980s. I think that that's pretty amazing. The New Deal also created a Federal Housing Administration. Right? The Federal Housing Administration, very complex piece of legislation. There's a lot of components to it, but just to give you in a nutshell what this was all about, the federal government chose to underwrite nearly $120 billion in new home investments between 1934 and 1962. But what they didn't do is they didn't put a lot of restrictions on how loans would be dealt with in the private sector. And so what happened is many companies that were providing these loans, even though they were getting underwriting and support from the federal government, were doing so in a way that they called redlining. What they were doing is they were giving loans to neighborhoods that were mostly white. If there were too many people of color that lived in your particular neighborhood, the opportunities for loans for new home ownership would be reduced. And what happens is over time the value of prices in those particular regions goes down. I'll give you some examples of how this worked. 98% of all those loans, 1934 to 1962, 1934 to 1962, 98% of all that money went to white America. 98% to white America. 350,000 homes built in Northern California between 1946 and 1960, 100 black families included in that. Of course, most of these homes are built where? In the suburbs, right? New suburban communities that are beginning to emerge, not in the city centers. And of course, what this does is it leads to a system of segregation, right? It's not segregation by law. We today might say it's by choice, but really, if a matter of you acquiring a loan is based on the color of your skin, it's not by choice. There's a reason why black Americans are stuck in the inner city. So today we call that preference, another example of that color blindness. Well, people just choose to live where they choose to live. There are no restrictions anymore. But this builds, this compiles. Over time, this becomes a dramatic way for families to enhance wealth and pass wealth on to future generations. Home ownership is the key. All right, that brings us to the 1960s. And I apologize if I'm rolling through this really quickly. If you have a question, please feel free to stop me. But in 1963, one of the seminal events of the Civil Rights Movement was the March on Washington. I tried to go back and look at all of the history textbooks that I have on my shelf, textbooks designed for college courses, the vast majority of them refer to this as the 1963 March on Washington. Some of them call it the March on Washington for Freedom. The actual title was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There's an economic component that we've sort of wiped away. We think of civil rights in the 1960s as political rights, not an argument or a debate for economic rights. Yet that was very much a part of what civil rights leaders were concerned with, from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, okay, all down the road. So I'm just throwing that out there so we remember what the exact title was. Right? Let's not kid ourselves. 3 major pieces of legislation in the 1960s that should have gone a long way, I think, to alleviate some of the problems that we're talking about. Really what these are doing is sort of enforcing what we should have done 100 years earlier. What we said we were going to do in the Constitution, we're creating new laws to provide some teeth, some enforcement. For 100 years we ignored it, now we're going to enforce it. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation, demands equal opportunity in hiring practices, right? So to give Black Americans economic opportunities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, African Americans were supposed to be able to vote in the 1860s, right? I mean, that should have happened a long time ago. And the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which was to curb that discrimination that we've talked about in the housing and the rental markets, and somebody brought that up earlier. But few of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 call for financing reform. It's all about what somebody can do when you show up in a particular neighborhood. If there's a new development in a suburb, can they deny you entry into that suburb based on the color of your skin? If they're selling you a home, no, as long as you can find financing. But that's the key, right? Can you find the financing for that particular home? So these 1960 acts, they're great attempts. But again, I think the idea is this on paper or is this for real? Are we living this? Just to give you some examples of how the 1960s civil rights movement was fragmented, different feelings, different agendas for people that were involved. I love this quote from James Baldwin. There's no reason that black men should be expected to be more patient, more forbearing, or more far-seeing than whites. Yet that seems to be a general trend in American history from a white perspective, that blacks should be happy with the progress they've made, even if that progress is slow. Whites, on the other hand, don't have to think about it from that perspective. So James Baldwin was very perceptive. And of course, people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and the whole Black Power movement tried to show Americans that there were deeper problems than just voting rights, just political issues that were involved. This is a matter of how blacks are portrayed, how they view themselves, how society treats them on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily when it comes time to go to the polling place. So these are individuals that have provided a great basis for us to go back and look at what's the missing component. Did we address the concerns of these folks? And I think the answer is no, we didn't. One more long quote, and I think it's worth putting up here, from Stokely Carmichael, one of the leaders of SNCC in 1966. White America will not face the problem of color, the reality of it. The well-intentioned say, we're all human, everybody is really decent, we must forget color. But color cannot be forgotten until its weight is recognized and dealt with. The topic that we're having today, he saw it in the 1960s. It's going to be really easy for Americans to say, individually, I don't treat anybody differently. But what about society? What does society do? And until you have a frank and open conversation about this past, can any real progress be made? I think very clearly we haven't had that discussion. So what is it like today? Black and Latino mortgage applicants still 60% more likely than whites to be turned down for a loan, even after you control for equal employment opportunities, financial packages, financial portfolio, a black family, a white family coming in with the same income, the same family income, 60% likely, greater likelihood that that black family will be denied a loan. What is the reason for that? There is no reason except race. That's where this lives. According to the census, whites are more likely to be segregated than any other group. As recently as 1993, 86% of suburban whites still lived in neighborhoods with a black population of less than 1%. So segregation ended in the 1960s. Or did it? Did it really? And of course, the dream for most Americans is that home in the hills, a home in the suburbs. The reality for most minority groups is that they're confined to urban centers for a variety of reasons that they can't escape, they can't change on their own. Just some examples of how wealth begets wealth, right? Wealth passed on from one generation to the next, especially in America, embodied in home ownership. That's the key. White families today possess a net worth that's 8 times greater than that for black families. One economist, Edward Wolff, tells us that up to 80% of a person's lifetime wealth accumulation can be traced back to earlier generations. In other words, your opportunities for success come to a great degree from earlier generations and how much support they can provide you. Families that are affluent can do great things to create opportunities for their children. Families that are poor have a difficult time overcoming that poverty. And of course, what I've already mentioned numerous times, home ownership is the key to that accumulation of wealth in American society. So structural racism, I've made a list here. You mentioned most of these already, but prisons, de facto segregation, health care, insurance, unemployment, drug use, victims of violent crime. Everywhere you look in American life, there are disparities between white America and black America. So the list goes on and on. Professor DeVivo, as I mentioned, is going to share some of those statistics with you. It is amazing when you start to look at it. How can a society that denies that racism is present live like this? That should be the key. Not what you say, but what you do, how you act. That should be the key. All right. So I see in this whole history, this brief history that I've given you, similarities between what happened in the post-Civil War era from 1860s to the 1960s and what's happening post-Civil Rights. In other words, we put some good things on paper at the end of the Civil War, but we didn't live it. We've put some really good things on paper in the Civil Rights era, but are we living it? That's the question. Do we live it every day? So what's going to happen? I've included this poem from Langston Hughes. It's one of my favorites, What Happens to a Dream Deferred. You can read through that, but the last line, of course, is the one that packs the punch. If you keep denying the American dream to groups of Americans over and over and over again, what happens to them? How will they react? How will they feel? Eventually, will it come back to haunt you? It's an amazing poem. And I wanted to give you an event from modern times, at least from a historical perspective. The 90s is modern times, although some of you probably don't remember it. But just a few minutes just to sit back and watch what happened in Los Angeles in 1992 after the Rodney King verdict was announced.
The present type of action, find the defendant, Lawrence M. Powell, not guilty of the crime of assault by force likely to produce great bodily injury and with a deadly weapon. In violation of Penal Code Section 24581, felony, as charged in count 1 of the amended indictment. This 29th day of April, 1992, signed by the foreman.
A group of demonstrators here, I would guesstimate there's 350 to 400 people out here, rushed Parker Center. They've been driven back by a line of LAPD officers, and right now it's pretty much a standoff. There's a line of LAPD officers out there, and there are a lot of demonstrators, and they are chanting for justice. They want justice is what they're saying.
There in the foreground you have the white smoke coming from that building. That's at Vermont and Manchester. Then looking directly in the center of the picture ahead, you have the other fire. That's at Normandy and Florence. That's that appliance shop that is going. So we see those two. And then there was the one earlier about 6 blocks north of that location. They're running back and forth. It looks like another looting operation directly below us. Look at all of the clothes, the debris. Their people are carrying out items. They're just running in and taking everything with them and running at full speed across the street and trying to disappear into the neighborhood.
Right now, tensions are building. The police have just wrestled a couple of people to the ground. The police have formed a long line now in front of Parker Center. One of the fires on Temple at Acacia, one of those fires was trees that had been set ablaze. Across the street there was another fire. A building was on fire.
There are, Martin said there are delivery trucks to the back, and there I can see some fire hose is working. Isn't that right? Doesn't someone have a fire hose on that? Yeah, probably a neighbor with a garden hose. An impossible job. But his house is located right behind that wall, and the fire is working its way to the back of the building toward his house, and he's making a stand with a garden hose, and that's the futility of the evening. This just didn't have to happen.
On the ground, sirens screamed from the command post at 54th and Arlington as an outmanned LAPD tried to contain a growing firestorm of violence. There were tense confrontations on angry street corners between cops with clubs and demonstrators venting more than a year of pent-up anger.
Hey, get that camera out of my face,
So in other words, some fires will simply have to go unattended, is that correct?
Fires will go unattended for a number of reasons, the first of which is that they have been reported to us. Secondly, that the situation in terms of the unrest in the community is such that puts our firefighters at risk, and we will not put those personnel at risk in situations that they can't deal with.
Now, I do know a couple of photographers out here were hit by rocks and bottles, including Tom McCosey, my cameraman. He was hit by a couple of bricks.
Now, this vehicle that you're looking at is a SWAT team vehicle. It's a truck which has officers wearing full body armor with their helmets, and they also have fully automatic weapons, both rifles and submachine guns and sidearms. This is inside that convenience store. You can see the entire store has been ransacked. Almost everything is gone from the inside that could have been carried out of there.
Merchants watched helplessly as the LAPD pulled back their lines and put on their combat gear. The equipment looked more like something out of the Gulf War than the police garage. Armored carriers ferried the troops, and cops with machine guns stood guard over firemen who were fighting a losing battle. Officers made isolated inroads, stopping these suspected looters outside a store in the Adams district. But they were usually too few and too late. Store after store and business after business fell prey to roving bands of youths who trashed what they could not carry and burned what they could not take. And the violence wasn't just against property, it was against people.
Okay, those are some startling images, and believe me, I didn't include the images of human-to-human violence. I didn't do that on purpose. I didn't necessarily want to glorify that or continue to spread it, but there was plenty of that in Los Angeles in the 90s as well. And so to me, this is a repercussion, an outlash, a striking back that occurs frequently in American history from time to time, and especially in America's urban centers. And there has to be some ability for Americans to deal with these particular issues. So I'll just use that as, we could have substituted in, I think very easily, New Orleans post-Katrina. And the images there, where every image you saw coming out of New Orleans was a black face suffering. A very, very powerful moment. So if race still matters in America, what happened to the racism? Right? Where is it? We have some hard questions to ask ourselves. All right, I'm willing to entertain any sort of questions in the 10 minutes that we have left. Or not. Yes, sir.
I don't know. You had mentioned earlier that Steele had written about white guilt. Is there a way to address that, or is that a silly question?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Shelby Steele wrote about white guilt.
Well, I guess a better way to put it is, like, what could someone who is white do without making it seem like it's out of white guilt? If I'm saying I treat everybody equally, is that saying I'm hiding racism? Or?
No, I think the message that I would have from my own personal perspective, now this isn't what Shelby Steele would say. What Steele is trying to say about that issue of white guilt is that he makes a big claim, for example, that affirmative action helps businesses and institutions of higher education justify that they're doing a good job in the post-civil rights era, because they can say, look at this number of black students or black workers that we have working for us. And I think what that does is it feeds into that idea of a quota system. What I would say is the problem is not so much that whether you agree or disagree with affirmative action or whether it should have been reformed, but this persistence of people to say that they're not individually racist shuts the walls of conversation down about whether society still has structural racism involved. Now, Shelby Steele is approaching it from a different perspective, but that's what I would say. For Americans, they've found an easy place, white Americans in particular, to say that there is no more guilt. I don't have to feel guilty. I don't have to feel ashamed. I'm not a racist. At the same time, there are all these structural inequalities in American life. And I think it stifles the conversation. It stifles the debate. It stifles the inquiry, and that's what we need to have more of. Yes?
Mike, you had mentioned and gave a quote of Madeleine Albright.
Yes.
And directed towards Germany because of its Nazi past. And I think that's kind of enlightening. Here you have somebody that works in a democratic administration.
Right.
Doesn't say it in that. This is when the first overtures of compensation were brought up during the Clinton administration.
Right.
I mean, seriously.
Sure.
She didn't address them towards our country. She addressed them towards a foreign country.
Yes. Madeleine Albright.
It's never been my experience that anyone, even in that administration, were willing to recognize a parallel. And of all people, Madeleine Albright, we found out she was a Jew.
Right.
And I thought, isn't that ironic? Just that example.
Yes.
Bam. I mean, that's a slap in my face again.
Yep.
Hell, we're all like that.
I agree. I don't think this has any sort of political limitations. It's not that one political party does it better than another. I think it's been a failure on the part of most mainstream white Americans, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, to do this. But that issue of Madeleine Albright going overseas and arguing about reparations payments and the validity of it is really powerful. We've had two presidents that have gone to Africa and apologized for the legacy of slavery in Africa. No formal apologies here in the United States from the president's office, which is amazing to me. It's very amazing. Yes?
With the idea of, or with African Americans after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, being able to purchase land and being able to own homes, and with that comes paying property taxes and whatnot, yet still not being able to vote isn't a legal argument for reparations. The taxation versus representation idea, where we were paying taxes for, to become a part of American society and be inundated into the whole tax system and governmental system, but still not being able to vote. Isn't that a legal argument for, could that be used as a legal argument?
A legal argument for reparations being the acquisition of property, the paying of taxes, and then not having the right to vote, so somehow you've been denied your voting rights. I'm not sure.
Money for to the government.
Yeah. I think there are better arguments, legal arguments for reparations than that, and I think part of the problem you're going to run into is that the vast majority of black Americans up through the 1970s couldn't acquire their own piece of ground. They couldn't acquire their own property. If you're a sharecropper, if you're a renter, it's not the same thing. So it wouldn't, I don't know if it would fall into those categories as neatly. And then would the argument be about the voting rights, or would it be about the payment you're due for the labor that's stolen? I think it's a bigger issue than just that. I'd have to think about that for a while, though. Yeah.
Have opponents of reparations payments argued that affirmative action is essentially an apropos response and essentially a payment of sort?
Opponents of affirmative action have argued everything under the sun. Of reparations. They've argued everything under the sun.
They viewed affirmative action as a...
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they have used that argument in the past. Lots of other arguments have been in place, like how would you decide who to pay? How do you determine who is a descendant of slaves? How do you determine who is involved in, should all white Americans be paying the taxes? Or my ancestors, they came to this country in the 1930s. Slavery was over. Should I be forced to pay taxes to support an institution that wasn't around or was around earlier before I arrived. There are all kinds of arguments against reparations.
Is there a pragmatic solution?
I don't know. I mean, personally, I'm not sure that reparations payments per se, from my perspective, would be healthy or beneficial or even possible, especially if it's $9.7 trillion. Hell, we can't pay for the war in Iraq, right? We can't pay for our schools. Well, yeah, even that would be a drop in the bucket. But I think the part that bothers me the most is that we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about the reality of it in our daily lives. And to have a debate about reparations, even if you didn't come up with a cash payment system, the debate would be healthy for us. The discussion, the argument. And, I'm talking about a public debate in the halls of Congress. That would be an amazing moment. Yes?
Well, and this idea that, of course, we have economic structures and social structures, they can be changed.
Right.
So that if you look at reparations and you're doing that to apologize and try to create some justice for what happened in the past, there's also the issue of what is currently in place. And I think it's been really helpful even to have that made even more visible and the whole economic piece of that. And yet the conversations that are had publicly about economic justice aren't had publicly about economic justice very much, although
right.
some are beginning. But that link between the two I thought was really a good starting point of how might we change some of it.
And that's one of the things that I want students to be able to understand, and Americans in general to be able to understand, is that economic component of slavery and inequality was there from the very beginning. I mean, that was the reason that slavery came about. The reason we have racism is because of enslavement. And you can't separate the two out. If you're going to destroy the legacy of slavery, you have to deal with that economic issue in some way. And too many Americans are too happy to walk around saying, everything's equal. My family struggled. My family, this isn't me, but I'll just, speak figuratively. My family they were Italian immigrants. Right? They were treated horribly. Or we were Irish immigrants. We were treated horribly. And to equate that to what the descendants of slaves have had to face is ridiculous. I'm not sure how else to describe it. Yes?
Mike, you did a nice job laying out the importance of home ownership, but then you've kind of took that up into like the early 80s. Is that an issue? I don't know if you know anything, a whole lot about that, but is that being addressed? Because that seemed to be part of your thesis, is home ownership as the key stepping stone to, that American dream?
In other words, from the 80s onward, has it gotten any better? I think we have seen some improvements from the 80s on, but not dramatic improvements. I mean, we celebrate all the time small, incremental steps toward black home ownership in American life. And there's still that problem of white flight. Even if you could work out the issue of the ability to acquire a loan, what happens when a black family moves into a predominantly white neighborhood? Do you start to see more for sale signs? Do people start to move? And it could be an unspoken thing, and we see that all the time. Blacks that are able to acquire property in the suburbs, very quickly, those suburbs, if blacks move in any sort of numbers, become almost all black suburbs. They become an extension of the inner city, and whites move further and further out. So I think the statistics are harder to come by the closer you get to the present. They are, however, getting better, but they're getting better at such a slow rate. So I would go back to James Baldwin's quote, why is it that black Americans have to celebrate such slow progress or be happy with such slow progress? There shouldn't be that difference, right off the bat.
Just the issue of Fannie Mae.
Yes.
3 years, the classic illustration.
Yeah.
And that exposure, I think, was so obvious that it's just so obvious.
It is. I think the more that you look, the more you keep your eyes open, the more you study the American past, these issues are really obvious. They jump out at you. You have to work really hard to stick your head in the sand for so long to not see these things as part of the world that we live in. And that would be my final message. Just keep your eyes open. Keep thinking. Keep keep questioning these things. That's the key. Thank you very much.